All right, we all know to knee-jerk say teenage pregnancy bad, but why? What is wrong with teenage pregnancy? Well, there are higher rates of complications. Teenage girls, and typically we define teenage pregnancy as between 10 and 19, and for most cases in the U.S., it's going to be somewhere between 13 and 19 that we would call teenage pregnancy. They have higher rates of anemia, which means that you don't have enough red blood cells to carry iron and fuel your cells. They tend to have longer labors than their even slightly older counterparts. They're more likely to experience a condition called toxemia. And then, of course, there are social effects. For mom, she's less likely to go on for further education. She may not finish her high school diploma, right? She may have to finish that as a GED or something like that later when she can swing it. She may not finish high school, let alone maybe pursue her college dreams or things like that. She's more likely to experience financial troubles. Without further education, a lot of times, especially a high school diploma, is kind of the gatekeeper for even entering into the most basic of jobs, right? So you have to really find a place to work that would be willing to accept you without a high school diploma. A lot of places look askance at a GED. Even, once you complete it, they'll look at it like, well, I mean, obviously you were a troublemaker, had something wrong, and that's why you had to finish it this way. Like there's this judgmental component about GEDs. And so these kinds of situations can lead to financial troubles for the rest of the mom's life. Moms who become pregnant in adolescence always say, I'm never having sex again. I am not going to have any more kids until I'm ready. But it turns out that on average, having a pregnancy in your teen years means that it's very likely that you'll have a second pregnancy in your teen years. So it's, it's really hard to not follow the biological imperative to have sex. It's really hard. And so, but meanwhile, socially, mom may not have even acknowledged that she might be a sexual person and might ever want to have sex again, and in fact denied it very vehemently that she was ever going to have sex again. And so she didn't take the proper steps to prevent a future pregnancy either. Now, some complications for the child. Children born to teenage moms have double the likelihood of being low birth weight. And if you guys all recall back to the pregnancy chapter, there's a whole host of things that go along with being low birth weight. They have triple the infant mortality rate of dying before their first birthday, 3 times as likely. They tend to have a higher probability of having a lower than average IQ score. It's not a guarantee, but it oftentimes goes along with low birth weight and other kinds of complications that can happen. So it can go together. And then it also, we see for the child, oftentimes the complication is that when they're older, they're described as having behavior problems. And some of this, again, might have something to do with, things that happened in what we call congenitally during the pregnancy, or it could be having to do with child rearing practices. It could be a lot of different things that could trigger these behavior problems that we see in children. But all we can say is that they are more common among children who had teenage moms. Same thing with the learning disabilities. If they are of average intelligence, they may have the kinds of learning disabilities we've talked about before. And, we're not exactly sure. It might have something to do with their birth weight. It might have something to do with, parenting. You don't know. All we know is that statistically these things are true. Now, the social effects for the child is they may show lower achievement in high school. Sometimes children of teenage parents look to their parents now and say, well, it all worked out. And then they think it's okay to think about becoming a teenage parent themselves. They may not take proper precautions because they kind of think this is what we do in my family, or it worked out fine for my mom, or these kinds of things. And then they don't protect themselves. So what causes teenage pregnancy? Okay, this is not a human sexuality class, so we're going to assume you all know what coitus is. So what we're talking about is the lack of contraception. Right? A lot of teenage moms report that they didn't use contraception because they weren't planning on having sex. They just got swept away in the moment. The really common explanation for teenage pregnancy: I wasn't prepared. I didn't think we were going to be having sex. And so I got swept away. I just thought, what the hell? What's the likelihood I'll get pregnant? And they got swept away. I would like to point out, as a human sexuality instructor, that when a woman or a girl is ovulating, she is way more attractive to the male. Like, she's putting out pheromones that he can pick up, and her ability to resist is way down. So when we go with this swept away mentality and then we're surprised, we're like, what's the likelihood I could have gotten pregnant? Well, it turns out that it was kind of not a fair, you didn't have a 1 in 30 chance thinking that I could get pregnant one day out of the month or something. You actually are in a boosted situation. The reason why you felt swept away is in part because of what your hormones are doing for you and what all is happening right now. All that stuff makes it more likely that you'll get swept away in the moment and more likely that you'll conceive from this act of coitus. Some teen moms say that they don't want to use contraception. They'll make statements about, well, I don't want to change my hormonal balance. And it's like, well, there's condoms. Well, he doesn't want to wear condoms. Well, you could use a sponge or a diaphragm. No, those are too messy. Like, they have an explanation for everything that they don't want to use those things. There's a big push right now to have IUDs inserted into teenage girls who show any kind of interest in birth control or anything. And IUDs are a semi-permanent type of birth control. You can insert the object into the uterus and leave it there for 2 to 5 years, depending on which product is used. And there's a big push because they are very reliable. But I've discovered that a lot of women who have IUDs were not told that the IUD that they had inserted contains hormones, and that the IUD that was inserted is actually probably the reason why they've gained weight and things like that. So it's kind of unfortunate that we're kind of tricking. I don't know if that's a good word that I should be saying on recording, but not giving women the full story about exactly what options they have, and instead are sort of, I don't want to say forcing, but encouraging them to use a method without the full information. That's what I'd like to say. So some teens say they don't want to use birth control. Some say they don't care if they get pregnant. What's the difference? It's no big deal. Some actually say that they want to get pregnant or that they wanted to get pregnant. So it's not always, a lot of times, if you are an adult and you're looking back on your teen years, you might think, well, maybe they didn't know. But it turns out that a lot of teens do know how they could have used contraception or what contraception could have done for them, but they didn't want to, or they wanted to get pregnant. Occasionally it's lack of knowledge. Sometimes they don't know how they could have gotten access to contraception or which one would work best for them. A lot of times they're too embarrassed to talk about the fact that they're thinking about having sex with their boyfriend or their girlfriend, and so they don't want to say anything. There's the invincibility fallacy. We're going to talk about that more in sociobiological development, but psychosocial development is what I meant to say. This is this belief that we carry around with us, and to a certain extent into adulthood we do it too. But in adolescence it's really powerful. This idea that those kinds of things happen to other people. Like, other people get unplanned pregnancies. It's not going to happen to me. And that causes them to take risks that they otherwise wouldn't take because they think, well, it's not going to happen to me. Like, I don't need to worry about that. So to illustrate that principle, we have a survey, the National Health and Sexuality Survey, questioned 14 to 17-year-olds and asked them, have you ever had sex? And of those who said that they'd had coitus, they asked, do you use birth control? 33% said never use birth control, and the other 2/3 said that they didn't always use birth control. There was nobody who said every single time. Like, nobody responded that. So now that's possible that, that those couple of people just weren't surveyed, but it's really common for teenagers not to use birth control on their first or even their second time that they're having coitus, and then they start to consider it. Sometimes they have contraception, but they're using it wrong. 40% of teenagers who were prescribed the pill report that they actually take the pill every single day. I didn't believe that statistic, and I was teaching human sexuality one time, and this student came up after, at the break, and she said, the pill makes me sick, and so I always end up throwing them up. And I go, every day? And she goes, no, just when I take them. I'm like, don't you take them every day? And she goes, no, I take all 7 of them on Friday. I'm like, no, you don't. That is not how you take the pill. No wonder you're throwing them up. You're taking 7? She was completely blown away. I'm like, what did you think the days of the week on the package meant? And she's like, I don't know. She wasn't thinking about it. Oh, and she was a college student. With condoms, they surveyed adolescents, and they found that, a third to half, depending on which survey sample, didn't know that you needed to leave space at the tip of the condom. A lot of condoms come with space at the tip, so it's kind of, self-explanatory. But I've heard of cases where they've tried to push the reservoir tip down onto the penis, and that is not how those work. Again, a third to half thought that you could use Vaseline as a lubricant if you're using condoms as your contraceptive, which you cannot do. If you want to test what I'm saying, get some Vaseline and a latex balloon, so you don't have to do this to a condom because those are expensive, and just sit there and rub the Vaseline onto the balloon until it dissolves the balloon. So do not use any kind of petroleum-based lubricant with a condom. And then 20% believed that if you got the really natural kind of condom, which is made out of lambskin, that it would protect better against HIV than latex condoms, which is the reverse. Lambskin condoms have really big pores in them and a knot at the end rather than a sealed end. So no, that doesn't protect against HIV anywhere near as well as a latex condom does. So a lot of kids do things incorrectly. What about who is likely to become a teenaged mom? So first off, note that the bars represent different years. From 1991 to 2007 is the lighter pink, 2011 is the orange, and 2019 is the amber. On the far left is if you average across all the races, then the next one is white, the next one is black, the next one's Hispanic, then Native, then Asian Pacific Islander. All right, so you'll notice that the highest bars are, I forgot to mention that the y-axis is the rate of pregnancy per 1,000 females in the age group 15 to 19. So you'll notice that in 1991, blacks and Hispanics had really, really high rates of teenage pregnancy. But as we get down to 2019, they've dropped down to, 25 out of 1,000 black and Hispanic girls becoming pregnant, roughly the same as natives. And then you see that whites have dropped down significantly to only 11 per 1,000, and Asians are down at 2.7 from their high of 27.3. So we've seen, whites are down a quarter from what they had been. Blacks are down, they're down to, they're less than a quarter of what their high had been, and same thing for Hispanics. For the Native women, we're looking at a third or a little bit more, maybe 40% of what they had been at their high. So we're seeing some really great progress, but we're still seeing racial disparities. And part of that has to do with how different ethnic groups value birth control, how different ethnic groups value babies, like as something that is desirable or something that would interfere with your life as a teenager. Like, those are two different attitudes. And so depending on the ethnic group that you come from, you may hold a different attitude about the possible harm that could come from being a teenage mom. Goal orientation is a really big factor in determining who becomes a teenage mom. A teenage girl who sees herself in a career and really is working toward that is more likely to take steps in adolescence to prevent an unplanned pregnancy than a teenage mom or a teenager who doesn't really have those kinds of goals and doesn't really know what she wants to do with her life. Goal orientation is very protective. High sex guilt is associated with a higher rate of teenage pregnancy. So if you feel like it's really super bad to become pregnant in adolescence or to have sex in adolescence, it actually makes it more likely that you will use the swept away logic and not be on birth control because you weren't going to have sex and end up pregnant. So high sex guilt is associated with a higher risk of becoming a teen mom. Age is another factor. The younger the person starts having sex, the longer they go having sex before they ultimately start using birth control. Half of teenage pregnancies occur in the first 6 months of sexual activity. So waiting longer to start using birth control means that you have a higher probability of becoming pregnant. It looks like age 16 is kind of a cutoff point for teenage girls to figure out that they should use birth control if they're going to be having sex. So if you start having sex when you're 13, you may go 3 years before you start to realize I need to use birth control. As opposed to if you can delay till you're 16, 17, 18 years old, you're much more likely to have a birth control method in place for your first sexual encounter. Relying on your partner for birth control is another big risk. Expecting your partner to come with a condom or whatever already prepared means that if your partner is not ready and doesn't have their birth control, you may go with the swept away, oh, what's the difference, let's go for it method and end up pregnant. And so relying on the partner, not wanting to look like I'm the sort of person who carries condoms with me, that kind of thing contributes to becoming a teenage mom. All right. The last thing I wanted to talk about is sex education, and I just wanted to share some statistics with you. According to a survey that was conducted about 10 years ago, I couldn't find a more recent version of it, about a quarter of teens don't get information about birth control from either their parent or from schools. So they don't have any authoritative anybody telling them anything about birth control. And then another survey, this was done in 2009, so again, I couldn't find anything more recent, but they asked the teenagers just to mark where did you learn about sex, and they could pick as many as they wanted. So if you add these up, you're going to notice that it adds up to more than 100%. So because they could pick multiples. But the most common source of information for both boys and girls was friends, followed by teachers because they had sex ed class, and then mom comes in next. Mom seems to be the most likely parent. Dad is down beyond media and doctors. It's kind of an interesting conundrum because dads have a unique opportunity to share some value system messages and other kinds of things that might be really helpful, but they oftentimes, especially with their daughters, avoid talking about sex. Brothers tend to inform their brothers, sisters tend to inform their sisters. Cousins are the most likely source for females compared to their male counterparts. So it's kind of interesting to see where the kids are getting their information about sex. There was a study that was conducted on where teens would like to get their information, and their number one preferred source of information would be their parents. But what you're seeing is they aren't necessarily getting it from their parents. And so the nice thing about parents sharing information is that they can include in that value system messages that teachers aren't allowed to really include to a certain level. And so teachers may be much more mechanical and talk about birth control and talk about STIs and talk about things very mechanically, whereas moms and dads can talk about things like what would be the virtue of waiting and what benefits would come to you as an individual, or are you in love with the person that you're considering, and these kinds of sort of much healthier things. So one thing, a lot of you may not have had children yet, or maybe have little children. If you do have kids, if you can share with them your insights and not tell them about your experiences, but talk to them about them. Talk to them about how they're feeling and where their relationship is. You can have a really big influence on their likelihood of using protection and other kinds of, avoiding. I thought I had a picture about the benefits of sex education. When we teach our children about sex education, they are more likely to use contraception, and they're more likely to avoid unhealthy relationships. There's like a whole bunch of stuff that comes from being open and honest about relationships in general and sex within relationships with your kids. So I would just like to really encourage you guys to, if you have access to your own children or your nieces and nephews, something like that, to have those kinds of conversations, because they want to know and they want to talk about their own things. They just don't want to be embarrassed. So, all right, well, that concludes the biological development during adolescence. I will see you in the next chapter for the cognitive development.